night smelled like money and danger. Scarlett Voss had learned long ago that those two things always traveled together. The crystal chandeliers, the polished marble floors, the men in Italian suits who smiled with their teeth while calculating exactly how many seconds it would take to end your life. The Hotel Blackmore's annual charity gala was exactly that kind of place. Beautiful on the surface, rotten all the way through. She adjusted the strap of her gown. Midnight red, backless, the kind of dress that made men look and made women nervous, and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. She didn't drink it. She used it as a prop, moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who belonged here, someone who had always belonged in rooms like this. She did not belong here, but she was very, very good at pretending. Target 1, confirmed in northeast corner. Julian Nero, 12 o'clock. 6 bodyguards, edgy. His men are watching the east corridor. That's where Agent Keene needs to move. She catalogued it all in seconds. A camera behind her eyes, a mission running beneath her smile like cold water under ice. Target 2, Dante Salvatore, stood at the center of the room, like it had been built around him. She'd studied his file for 6 months. Photographs, surveillance footage, wiretap transcripts. None of it had prepared her for this. He was taller than she expected. 6'3" in a black suit that cost more than her monthly salary. Broad-shouldered, built like a man who had never once in his life been told no and survived the telling. His face was the kind painters used to carve into marble and pretend was a god, hard jaw, dark eyes, a mouth set in a permanent line that said, "Try me." He wasn't smiling. He hadn't smiled once in the 40 minutes she'd been watching. He didn't need to. Around him, a constellation of advisors and family captains orbited at careful distances. His consigliere, Marco Valentino, stood at his left shoulder, compact, watchful, the kind of man who had a knife behind every button. His younger brother, Carlo, lingered at the edge of the group with a champagne flute and a practiced look of casual indifference that didn't fool Scarlett for a second. The tension in the room was a living thing. Dante Salvatore and Julian Nero had not spoken. They occupied opposite corners of the ballroom like two magnets turned wrong side out. Every person in the room unconsciously aligning with one or the other. A fault line running invisible down the center of the marble floor. She needed to fracture that stillness. She needed Julian's men looking away from the east corridor for approximately 90 seconds. She needed to do something no one in this room would expect. Scarlett. Her handler's voice buzzed soft through the nearly invisible earpiece. "Keene's in position. He needs the window. Now." "I know," she thought, and set down her champagne. She crossed the room. Later, she would tell herself she hadn't known exactly what she was doing. That was a lie. She knew. She knew precisely. She had calculated the risk and decided the mission was worth it, and if Dante Salvatore was as controlled as his file suggested, he would react with cold displeasure. A dismissal, maybe. A quiet word to security, and the distraction would serve its purpose. She had not calculated for what actually happened. She stopped in front of him. 7 pairs of eyes snapped to her, his men sharp and immediate. But she looked only at Dante, tilting her head with a slow, deliberate smile, like she had all the time in the world and had been waiting to find him here specifically. "You look lonely," she said. Silence, the kind that had weight. His eyes moved over her once. Slow, thorough. Not leering, assessing. Like she was a contract he was reading before signing. "Do I?" Not a question. She reached out, and God help her, she actually did it, and straightened the already straight pocket square on his lapel. Her fingers brushed his chest. "The brooding suits you, but you're making everyone nervous. Even your brother looks like he needs a drink." Across the room, she heard it, a ripple of something through Julian Nero's camp. His men had turned, looking. Julian himself had looked. "Good. Keep looking." "You're touching me," Dante said very quietly. "I am." She let her hand fall, but she held his gaze. "Is that a problem?" A muscle moved in his jaw. One single, controlled movement. Behind her, at the east corridor entrance, she heard, barely heard, the soft, careful sound of a door. Keen was moving. "You're brave," Dante said, and his voice was silk over stone. "Or you're stupid. Why can't I be both?" She laughed softly, leaning in just slightly, enough that someone watching from a distance would read flirtation, would read bold woman throwing herself at the most powerful man in the room, which was exactly what she needed them to read. She heard Julian Nero say something, low and amused, to the man beside him. She'd done it. She'd drawn every set of eyes in the room. She had exactly 10 more seconds of this, and then she would excuse herself, disappear into the crowd, and never come within 100 feet of Dante Salvatore again. That was the plan. Then his hand closed around her wrist. Not rough, not painful, absolute. His grip was warm and iron-sure, and in the space of one heartbeat, everything changed. He stepped into her space, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone across the room would read as anything other than intimacy. And she felt the entire world narrow down to the 6 inches between his mouth and her ear. His breath was warm. His voice was barely sound, a vibration more than a word. "Listen carefully, Bella," he murmured, "because I will only say this once." Her pulse went haywire. Every trained instinct she had screamed exit. Her body did not move. "You just made yourself the most interesting woman in this room," he continued, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the universe, "and you did it in front of a man who collects interesting women the way other men collect debts." A pause, barely a breath, "which means you are either here for me, or you are about to become someone else's problem." She swallowed. "Either way," Dante Salvatore said softly, and she felt the words against her skin like a brand. "You're not going anywhere?" He pulled back, looked at her, and for the first time that evening the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more dangerous than a smile. He raised his hand, and Marco Valentino was at his side in 3 seconds flat. "She stays," Dante said. "Scarlett Voss, 27 years old, 6 years of FBI field training, decorated twice for bravery under fire, stood in the center of the most dangerous room in Chicago and realized, with cold clarity, that she had walked into a trap she had built herself, and the man who just sprung it was looking at her like she was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. Scarlett. Alara's voice in her ear, urgent now. "What just happened?" "Keen's out. You can move." Scarlett respond. She said nothing. She smiled instead. Slow, deliberate, every inch the bold woman she was pretending to be. And let Dante Salvatore lead her deeper into the room. "You're not going anywhere." No. She supposed she wasn't. She had been in worse situations. She repeated this to herself approximately 40 times over the next 3 hours, like a prayer, like a lifeline, as Dante Salvatore's black SUV carried her through the streets of Chicago at midnight, and she sat in the leather back seat with Marco Valentino on one side, Carlo Salvatore on the other, and Dante himself in the front. Not driving, just sitting, one hand resting on his knee, watching the city pass like he owned it. He did own it. That was the problem. She catalogued what she had. One phone, currently confiscated. Marco had taken it with a polite, implacable, for the evening. One tiny earpiece that was useless now that Alara had gone silent, and a lipstick case with a panic transmitter hidden in the base. She had not pressed it yet. She wouldn't. Not until she understood the shape of what she'd walked into. The estate was outside the city, 40 minutes northeast, hidden behind a wall of oak trees and iron gates that slid open without a word from anyone in the car. She'd memorized what she could. The approach road, the security cameras, 14 visible, certainly more she couldn't see, the guard positions, 2 at the gate, 3 walking the perimeter. The house itself was not what she expected. She'd expected cold, glass, and steel, something that looked like ambition made architectural. Instead, it was old stone and warm light. 3 stories of old-world architecture surrounded by manicured grounds, the kind of house that whispered of generations rather than acquisition. Gargoyles watched from the roofline. Ivy climbed the east wall. It looked like a place where people had lived and loved and mourned for a very long time. It looked, despite everything, like a home. Don't get confused, she told herself. Pretty cages are still cages. Inside, marble floors, rich wood paneling, portraits of Salvatore men going back several generations, all of them dark-eyed, all of them carrying the same particular quality of absolute authority in their expressions. A library, a fireplace large enough to stand in, staff who moved silently and did not make eye contact. Dante stopped in the center of the entrance hall. He looked at her, really looked at her, stripping away the performance of the gala in a way that made her stomach tighten. Name, he said. Chloe, she said. The cover name was automatic, practiced. Chloe Marsh. That's not your name. She held his gaze. It's the one I'm giving you. Something moved in his expression. Amusement, she thought. Dark amusement, like a man watching a mouse claim it wasn't afraid of cats. Your room is on the second floor, he said, as if she'd agreed to stay. Elena will show you. A woman appeared immediately, 50-something, gray-streaked hair, a housekeeper's quiet efficiency. You won't try to leave tonight. And if I do? There are 22 armed men between you and the gate. He said it without inflection. Not a threat. A fact. Get some sleep. We'll talk in the morning. He walked away. Just like that. Like she was a problem he'd already filed. The room was beautiful, which made everything worse. Cream walls, a 4-poster bed with linens that probably cost more than her couch, a window that overlooked a garden pale with moonlight. The window was triple-latched with an alarm strip on the frame. She checked, because of course she did. The door locked from both sides, but only her side currently held a key. Small mercies. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself be Scarlett Voss for exactly 60 seconds. No cover, no performance, just her and the raw reality of what she'd done. She'd gotten on that man's radar, not just on it, under it. He'd looked at her like something he was going to take apart to see how it worked. She pulled the lipstick case from the clutch Marco had returned. One press. Alara would know she was alive. That would have to be enough. In the morning, Dante Salvatore came to find her himself. She was already dressed, the gown exchanged for clothes she'd found folded on the chair. Someone had anticipated her needs with unsettling efficiency. Dark jeans, a cream blouse, boots that fit perfectly. She was standing at the window when the door opened, and she turned to find him watching her with coffee in his hand. He looked different in daylight, still dangerous. More dangerous, maybe. In a simple white shirt and dark trousers, sleeves rolled to the forearms, the kind of casual that only very powerful men could wear like armor. There was a scar on his left forearm, she noticed. Pale and thin. Old. Sit down, he said, and set a second cup of coffee on the table between them. I'll stand. I wasn't asking. She sat down. He folded himself into the chair across from her with the economy of motion of a man who had never once in his life been in a hurry. He drank his coffee. He looked at her. You walked up to me, he said, in front of Julian Nero. You touched me. You made a spectacle. I was being friendly. Women who walk up to me at functions attended by my enemies are not being friendly. His eyes were very dark, very still. They are being useful to someone. The question is who. Her heart beat steadily. She had trained for this, the interrogation disguised as conversation, the slow dissection dressed in civility. Maybe I just thought you were attractive, she said. Maybe. He considered her. But you also scanned the room 4 times in the first 30 seconds after you spoke to me. Your eyes went to exits twice, and you tracked my men's positions with the kind of precision that doesn't come from curiosity. He set down his cup. So I'll ask you once, who sent you? Silence. I own you now, he said softly, and it landed in the air between them like a stone in still water. Until I have that answer. You understand? She met his gaze. She understood, and buried beneath the ice of her training, in a place she refused to acknowledge. Something in her chest answered the words, I own you not with fear, but with a warmth that terrified her far more. The empire, she discovered, was vast, She had 3 days in the Salvatore estate before the shape of Dante's world became clear to her. Not through conversation, he shared nothing directly, testing her with silence as much as words, but through observation. She had always been better at watching than asking. The estate was a nerve center. Men came and went at all hours, captains reporting to Marco in the East Wing, deliveries that were logged with the careful attention of men who understood that paperwork was as much a weapon as a gun. Dante held court in his study from 8 in the morning until well past midnight. The door always open, the activity around him constant and purposeful. She pieced it together like a mosaic. Territories across the Midwest, legitimate businesses as cover, construction, import, hospitality, and beneath all of it, the darker commerce that kept the machine running, weapons brokerage, enforcement contracts, the kind of power that didn't advertise itself because it didn't need to. The Salvatore family had controlled Chicago's underworld for 3 generations. Dante had inherited it at 26, when his father, Don Enzo Salvatore, was shot dead in his own kitchen by a gunman who was never identified. Dante had been 26 years old, newly appointed as underboss. And the very next morning he had walked into a room with the 3 men his father suspected and walked out alone. No bodies were ever found. She'd read that in the file, seeing it in the way the men moved around him. Not with the anxious deference of men who feared punishment, but with the absolute steadiness of men who believed utterly in their general, made it real in a way the file never had. She also, over those 3 days, began to understand the problem. Her mission had been straightforward in theory. Get close to Dante Salvatore, gather intelligence on his weapons pipeline, build a case that would take down the Salvatore family and put a permanent dent in organized crime in the Midwest. Standard deep cover, 6 months of preparation, perfect placement, clean exit after the gala. Instead, she was living in his house, eating his food, and fighting a very private battle against the fact that she found him compelling in a way that had nothing to do with the mission. It wasn't his looks, though; those were aggressively difficult to ignore. It was the way he moved through his world, not with the performative brutality she'd expected, but with this quiet, absolute certainty. He made decisions in seconds that she knew lesser men would agonize over for days. He was ruthless without being cruel. He was, and this was the most dangerous discovery, principled. In his own dark, blood-stained way, Dante Salvatore had a code, and she was in the middle of violating it. On the 3rd night, Carlo found her in the library. She'd been working her way through Dante's bookshelves, genuinely reading, genuinely curious, and also cataloging the room, when the younger Salvatore appeared in the doorway with 2 glasses of scotch and an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You're still here," Carlo said, handing her a glass she hadn't asked for. "Appears so." He settled into the chair across from her with the studied ease of a man trying to look unthreatening. He was handsome in a softer way than his brother. The same dark eyes, but warmer. More accessible, less honest. "He likes you," Carlo said. "He doesn't know me. With Dante, it's the same thing." He swirled his glass. "Just be careful. People who get close to my brother tend to pay for it." She looked at him steadily. "Is that a warning or a threat?" "Friendly advice," he said with a smile she almost believed. He left. She sat with his words and the weight of what she hadn't yet told him, or Dante, or anyone. Her father's name had been Thomas Voss. 5 years ago, Thomas Voss had been a federal informant, feeding intelligence on Chicago's crime networks to the FBI. 5 years ago, Thomas Voss had been found in a warehouse on the south side with 2 bullets in him, and the evidence trail, carefully constructed, she now suspected, carefully planted, had pointed to the Salvatore organization. She had spent 5 years becoming the kind of agent who could put Dante Salvatore in prison. But sitting in his library, 3 days into the world he'd built, she was starting to pull at a thread that the official record had never bothered to examine. The 2 bullets in her father's chest had come from a gun traced to a man named Felix Greco, a known associate. Not of the Salvatore family, but of the Nero syndicate, Julian Nero's men. The thought had lived in the back of her mind for weeks before the gala. She'd pushed it aside. It was easier when Dante Salvatore was a photograph in a file. It was harder now. On the 4th morning, she was sitting on the stone wall of the garden, watching the sunrise paint the oak trees gold. When Dante appeared beside her without sound, she had not heard him coming, and she had excellent ears which told her something about the way he moved when he chose not to be noticed. He sat beside her, not close, but close enough. They watched the light change for a long minute without speaking. "My father built this garden," he said finally. "He used to say it was the only honest thing on the property." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the trees, and for one unguarded moment in the early morning light, he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "What happened to him?" she asked, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. He was quiet for a moment. "Someone he trusted." She held that, let it settle. From the east side of the property, from the direction of the security gate, a burst of movement. 3 of his men jogging toward the main house with the focused urgency that meant something had changed. Dante was on his feet before she registered the motion, all warmth gone. All of him suddenly coiled and specific and dangerous again. He turned to her, and his eyes swept her, quick, assessing. "Go inside," he said. "What's happening?" Inside Scarlet. She froze. Scarlet. Not Chloe. Not Bella. Scarlet. He already knew. He was already walking toward his men, and the look he'd given her over his shoulder, not anger, not accusation, something that looked disturbingly, frighteningly like he'd been waiting, told her that the dangerous game she'd thought she was playing had changed all the rules. Someone, she realized with cold certainty, is already watching. And it's not just him. He knew. Not everything. She was still measuring the edges of what he knew. But her real name, at minimum, probably more. He'd had 3 days and the resources of a criminal empire. She should have pressed the panic transmitter the first night. She hadn't, and she was done lying to herself about why. She found him in his study an hour after the garden, and he let her find him, which told her he wanted this conversation to happen on his terms. His men had dispersed. Marco stood outside the study door and met her eyes with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had seen everything and judged nothing, which somehow felt worse than hostility. She pushed the door open and went in. Dante was behind his desk, jacket discarded, sleeves still rolled. He had a glass of water and a photograph. She couldn't see what, of which he sat face down when she entered. He didn't look surprised to see her. He didn't look much of anything, and she was learning to read the space where his emotions should have been as a language of its own. "Sit," he said. This time she didn't argue. "Scarlett Voss," he said. Her full name and his voice had a weight she hadn't expected. FBI, Field Operations, Chicago Division, 6 years, 2 commendations, Deep Cover Specialist. He looked at her. "Did I miss anything?" Her pulse was steady. She was proud of that. "My coffee preference," she said. "Black, no sugar." The corner of his mouth moved. "I want to be angry," he said, and the honesty of it, the simplicity, caught her off guard. "You came into my house under a lie. You made yourself bait and used me as the hook." He tilted his head. "But you already knew the risk. You walked up to me in a room full of people who would have killed you for less than what you did, and you didn't hesitate." He paused. "Why? The mission required." "Not the mission." He leaned forward. "You. Why?" She stared at him. "Because," she thought, and didn't say, "my father's blood is on someone's hands, and I needed to know if it was yours." "Julian Nero was in that room," she said instead. "My operation targets the Nero Syndicate. You were a distraction, a means to an end." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the study windows, the morning had gone gray, and the first drops of rain were beginning to tap against the glass. She watched his face and tried to find the calculation she expected, the anger, the Mafia Boss's response to being played, and found instead something more complicated than that. "Your father," Dante said. "Thomas Voss." The air went out of the room. She said nothing. Every trained response she had evaporated. "I know what the file says," he continued, watching her carefully. "I also know what the file doesn't say." He picked up the photograph he'd turned over and slid it across the desk toward her. She picked it up. It was a photograph of a man she didn't recognize. nondescript, middle-aged, photographed from a distance in what looked like a parking garage. Tucked beneath it was a single sheet of paper, a transcription of a phone call dated 14 months before her father's death, between this man, identified in Dante's notes as one Felix Greco, and an unidentified second party. She read it. Read it again. The instructions were precise and merciless. Thomas Boss, the location, the timing, and then make sure it traces back to Salvatore. Nero wants the war. Nero wants the war. Her hands were not entirely steady when she set the paper down. Where did you get this? Her voice was barely her own. I have spent 4 years looking for whoever killed my father, Dante said quietly. I believe the same man ordered both deaths. I believe they were killed to start a war between my family and the Nero Syndicate, a war that would have destroyed us both and left the field open for someone else entirely. He paused. I have been working toward Julian Nero for 4 years, and then, 3 nights ago, a woman who moves like an agent and reads a room like a soldier walked up to me at a gala where Nero and I were breathing the same air for the first time in 18 months, and she didn't touch Julian. She touched me. Silence. You were a gift, he said softly, that I didn't know I was waiting for. She should have said something clinical, professional, reminded herself of the mission, of the badge, of every reason she was in this room that had nothing to do with the way his voice sounded when it dropped to that register, and she felt it in places that had no business responding. Instead, she said, your father was killed the same way mine was. Yes, and you think Julian Nero signed both death warrants? Dante said. I have believed that for 3 years. What I haven't had is proof I could use. Proof beyond what my hands could accomplish. He looked at her steadily. You have the apparatus of the federal government behind you. I have the Salvatore family behind me. A long pause. Together. She stood up, because if she didn't, she was going to agree with him, and she couldn't afford to agree with him. Not yet. Not until she understood what agreeing with Dante Salvatore cost. She moved to the window. The rain was coming properly now, streaming down the glass, and the garden her father would never see was blurring soft and green behind it. She didn't hear him move. She felt him, warmth behind her, not quite touching, close enough that the fine hairs on her arms stood to attention. I'm sorry, he said, and it was so quiet, so unperformed that it broke something behind her sternum. For your father. For the years you spent pointing your anger at the wrong person. She turned. He was very close. Close enough that she could see the old scar along his jaw. She hadn't noticed that one before. And the precise darkness of his eyes, and the fact that for all the iron control of him, his jaw was tight in a way that told her this cost him something too. Dante, she said, and his name in her mouth sounded different than she'd intended. Softer, more familiar. His hand came up, slowly, giving her every moment to move away, and his thumb brushed the line of her cheekbone. Just that. Just one touch, careful as a question. She didn't move away. Don't, she told herself, and leaned infinitesimally into his hand. His breath changed, and then his mouth was on hers. Not demanding, not the claiming she'd half expected from a man like him, but careful. Slow and careful, like he was afraid she was breakable. Or like he was afraid he was, and the tenderness of it hit her harder than force would have. She kissed him back, for exactly 4 seconds. She kissed Dante Salvatore back, in the rain-soft quiet of his study, with her dead father's evidence between them on the desk and every rule she'd ever sworn to herself dissolving in the heat of his mouth. Then she pulled back. He let her. His hand stayed at her jaw for one more moment, then fell. They looked at each other. This is a bad idea, she said. Most things worth having are, he replied. I'll burn the world for you, he added, barely above a whisper, and the certainty of it, the absolute unhesitating certainty, should have terrified her. Instead it felt, God help her, like a promise. The Salvatore family council met in the basement, 3 days after the kiss that she was absolutely not thinking about. Dante brought her to a meeting she had no right to attend. She understood, going in, that this was a test of her nerve, of her judgment, of what she was made of underneath the cover story. She also understood that if she failed it, the consequences would be immediate. The basement of the Salvatore estate had been many things over the decades. Wine cellar, safe room, she suspected at various points something considerably darker. Now it held a long table, 8 chairs, 8 of the most powerful criminal figures in the Midwest, and a silence that was specifically calibrated to be intimidating. She did not let it work. She sat at Dante's left, Marco at his right, Carlo further down, and kept her spine straight and her face neutral and catalogued every man in that room with the thoroughness of someone who understood she might need to testify about them someday. The meeting covered territories, disputes, a shipment problem in the Southern District, and a captain named Ronaldo who had been skimming. That last item was addressed in 30 seconds. Ronaldo would not be skimming again. Dante's voice did not change when he gave the order, which was somehow more frightening than if it had. Then the topic shifted to Julian Nero. "He's moved 2 crews into the River North Corridor," said a captain named Ferretti, heavy-jowled and careful. "It's a provocation." "It's a declaration," Marco corrected. "It's neither," Dante said. "It's an invitation. He wants us to respond." His eyes moved briefly to Scarlett. "We won't. Not yet." "We look weak," Ferretti said. "We look patient." Dante's voice carried no argument. "There's a difference. The patient man wins the war. The reactive man wins a battle and dies before he sees what it cost him." The meeting concluded. The captains filed out. Carlo lingered, watching Scarlett with an expression she caught in the corner of her eye, assessing, and not kindly. Afterward, alone in the corridor, Marco fell into step beside her. "You handled yourself well," he said without looking at her. I sat quietly. "With 8 men who've killed for less than disrespect, in a room where you had no right to be, without flinching." He glanced at her sideways. "That's not nothing." She appreciated that he said it like a fact rather than a compliment. She almost told him. She almost opened her mouth right there in the corridor and told Marco Valentino exactly who she was, because something in his straightforwardness made her trust him, and she was so tired of carrying the weight of what she was doing alone. She didn't. Not yet. That evening, one of Julian Nero's men was found on the western edge of Salvatore territory. He was alive. Barely, and not by accident. He had a message carved into his arm in the crude, particular shorthand of the Nero Syndicate. "Give us the girl." Dante's reaction was not what she expected. She had braced for cold fury, the contained, controlled anger she'd come to associate with him. Instead, he went very still in a way that was somehow more frightening. His eyes went to her, and they were absolute. "Who knows you're here?" he asked. "My handler," she said. "Alara Chase and my partner, Agent Keene. Can you trust them?" She thought about that, honestly. Alara, yes. Keene. She'd worked with him for 3 years. She thought so. Yes. Then Julian doesn't know what you are. He knows you are a woman who caught my attention at the gala. He picked up his phone, which means he wants to use you to get to me. Or he knows exactly what I am, she said. And he wants to use me to compromise the FBI investigation. Dante looked at her. Both scenarios require the same response, he said. In the armory. She hadn't known the estate had one. She should have guessed. He unlocked a case and set a Sig Sauer P22T6 on the shelf in front of her. Can you use that? She picked it up, checked the chamber, cleared it, and reset the mechanism in 6 seconds flat. His eyes changed. Good, he said. There was something in the word approval, yes, but also something more private, something that had nothing to do with the gun and everything to do with her. Like the fact that she could handle herself was the most attractive thing he'd encountered in years. She holstered the weapon. I need to tell you something, she said. Tell me. The Felix Greco call, the evidence you have. I need to get it to my handler. Officially. She met his eyes. I can't build a case on information I can't explain how I obtained. I know. Which means, at some point, I'm going to have to tell her where I've been for the last week. What I've been doing, who I've been with. She paused. She's going to want to pull me. Can she? His voice was even. She can try. The silence stretched between them. She felt, oddly, like she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't step back from. And more oddly still, she wasn't sure she wanted to. Dante. She said his name carefully. I need to know something. About my father, about the evidence, about all of it. She looked at him straight. Are you telling me the truth? He looked at her for a long moment. Longer than she'd ever seen him look at anything without acting. I've told you the truth about everything, he said, including the parts that could get me killed. He held her gaze. That should tell you something. It did. From upstairs, a burst of sound, running feet, glass breaking. Marco's voice, sharp and immediate. Dante. Front gate. And somewhere, in the shadowed corner of the corridor outside the armory, Scarlett caught a glimpse of Carlo Salvatore, watching her, with an expression she had seen before, in photographs, in files, in the face of a man who had just been caught. Betrayal suspected, whispered a cold voice in the back of her mind. Already in the house, they came at 3 a.m, 5 vehicles, 23 men, professional, coordinated, and completely willing to die in the attempt, which told Dante everything he needed to know about who was paying them. Hired soldiers didn't move like this without a very large check and a very credible threat of what would happen if they failed. He was already awake. He'd been awake for 40 minutes because something in the quiet of the house had changed its quality. A shift in air pressure, a silence slightly too complete, and he had learned long ago to trust that feeling with his life. He'd gone to Scarlett's door first. She'd opened it before he knocked. Dressed, armed with the cig, alert in a way that told him she'd felt it too. East wall, she said quietly. 2 minutes, he said. Stay with me. What followed was 30 minutes of violence, precise and controlled as surgery. Dante moved through his own house like he owned every shadow in it, because he did. He knew which floorboards didn't creak, which corridors gave angles, which rooms offered cover and which offered exposure. He'd walked this house in his mind at every hour of the day and in every configuration of threat for 8 years. He was ready. His men were ready. They weren't. The first 3 attackers who came over the east wall were met with Salvatore soldiers before they touched the ground. The next wave pushed through the garden and took fire from 2 directions. Dante was at the back of the house, flanked by Marco and 2 captains, when he heard it. A burst of gunfire from the west corridor, close, and Scarlett's voice cutting through. I've got 2 on the ground floor. He moved. He moved faster than was careful, faster than his training told him to. And if Marco called his name, he didn't hear it. She was at the corridor junction, back to the wall, the cig in both hands, calm as a surgeon. 1 man was already down. The second was advancing. She fired twice, center mass, and he dropped. Dante reached her in 3 strides. He put himself between her and the corridor without thinking about it. He put himself between her and the entire house without thinking about it. His hand closed on her arm, not gripping, anchoring, and he swept the corridor with the other hand and the weapon it held. Clear? He said. Clear on my end. Her voice was steady, her hands were steady. Yours? Almost. She'd killed 2 men tonight. She hadn't flinched. Something shifted in him. Not something new, he recognized it as something that had been there since the garden, since the library, since the rain against the study window. But it settled, in the aftermath of violence, the way things did when crisis stripped everything unessential away. He looked at her. Blood on her forearm. Not deep, a graze, she hadn't told him. She was looking at him with eyes that were darker than usual and completely without pretense. And God, she was. You're bleeding, he said. It's nothing. You're bleeding. He turned her arm, examining it, and she let him. And neither of them said anything about the fact that his hands were very careful where they held her. In the garden, the last of the assault was ending. His men were efficient. It took another 4 minutes. Then silence, the deep, specific silence of aftermath, the kind that had a smell, copper and powder, and a feel, like the world holding its breath. He turned back to her, in the pale light of the corridor, with the sounds of his men securing the grounds echoing behind them. She looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw it in her face. She had seen his monster tonight, fully, without the civil veneer of the study or the quiet of the garden. She had seen him give orders with no hesitation, seen men fall at those orders, seen him move through violence like water through a break in a dam, natural, inevitable, unstoppable, and she hadn't run. She was still here. "Say it," she said softly. He looked at her, questioning. "The thing you're thinking. Say it." "You're mine," he said. Not a declaration of possession. Not the cold claiming he was capable of. Something underneath that. Older than the Mafia code, older than the violence, rawer than either. Mine the way a man says it when he means I will burn down everything in the known world before I let anything touch her again. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, "I know," she said quietly. He kissed her. Not careful this time, not slow. He kissed her with everything the last 6 hours had packed into his chest. Relief and fury and a tenderness so fierce it came out like hunger. And she kissed him back with the same completeness, both hands in his jacket, pulling him in like she was using him for gravity. And the corridor and the blood and the bodies outside dissolved into a single moment of brilliant, aching clarity. "Yours," she didn't say, but he felt it. He felt it in every place she touched him. "War is coming," Marco said from the end of the corridor. His voice was perfectly even. He had the grace to have been looking at the ceiling. Dante lifted his head, met his oldest friend's eyes. "Yes," he said. The bodies in the garden agreed. The war came the way all real wars do, not in a single dramatic declaration, but in accumulation. Piece by piece, provocation answering provocation, until the weight of it cracked the ground and everything fell through. In the 10 days following the assault on the estate, the Salvatore Nero conflict moved from cold to scalding with a speed that left no room for miscalculation. 2 Salvatore captains were attacked in their territories. A Salvatore warehouse, legitimate construction materials, burned to the ground. On the second day, a message arrived through an intermediary. Julian Nero would meet, in neutral ground, to discuss terms. Dante sent back a single word. No. Scarlett spent those 10 days in a state of suspended tension, working, planning, rebuilding the architecture of the operation from the ground up with Ilara. 2 careful phone calls, conducted in code. Ilara's voice carefully not saying what she was thinking, which was almost certainly come home, and moving through the growing weight of the Salvatore estate like she was learning a new language. She and Dante existed in the space between what had happened in the corridor and what neither of them had yet said out loud. He was careful with her, not in a way that suggested fragility, but in the way of a man recalibrating around a new constant. His hand at her back in crowded rooms, his voice when he checked on her, stripped of its professional evenness to something rougher and more honest, the way Marco watched them both and said absolutely nothing, which Scarlett was beginning to understand was his version of approval. Carlo? She watched. She watched Carlo the way she'd been trained to watch suspects, patiently, without letting her attention show. He was good at the performance of normalcy. He laughed at the right moments, contributed to family discussions with the easy confidence of a man who belonged. But twice, she caught him on his phone in rooms he thought were private. And once, just once, she saw him speaking with a man she didn't recognize in the South Garden at dawn. A brief exchange of something small and physical that registered in her trained brain as transaction. She didn't tell Dante, not yet. She needed more. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. Marco was driving back from a meeting with a Salvatore allied family when his convoy was ambushed on Route 19. 3 vehicles. Precision timing. Inside knowledge. They'd known the route, the timing, the exact vehicle configuration. Marco survived. 2 of his men didn't. He came back to the estate with a shattered wrist, a bullet through his shoulder that had missed the artery by a centimeter, and an expression of contained fury so profound it aged him 10 years. Dante sat with him in the medical room while the estate doctor worked, and Scarlett watched from the doorway as the controlled, certain man she'd come to know sat beside his oldest friend and held his uninjured hand with a quietness that broke something in her chest. The monster learned to feel, she thought. He never stopped. Afterward, in the war room, The captains arranged themselves around the table with the focus of men who had been waiting for permission. Narrow, Ferretti said. Narrow, Dante confirmed. All of it. Everything we've been holding back. He looked around the table. It ends. She was in the doorway again. He found her eyes across the room, and the look he gave her was layered. The commander beneath the man beneath the lover. All three of them focused entirely on her in the space of a second. You'll be safe, it said. I swear it. She should have stayed close. An hour later, while the war room was consuming every available man in coordinated deployment plans, Scarlett slipped outside to the rear garden, phone in hand, to call Alara. She needed to relay the ambush intelligence. She needed Alara to cross-reference the route leak with internal records. If someone inside the Salvatore family had given Nero the convoy route, there would be a digital footprint. She was 3 minutes into the call when she heard it. Not footsteps. The specific sound of an absence of footsteps. The studied quiet of a professional. She turned. Too late. The sedative hit her in the neck before she could raise the SIG. She felt it immediately. A flooding warmth. A pulling darkness, her legs going soft beneath her. She had time for one thought as the garden tilted sideways. The hand that caught her before she hit the ground was gloved. Carlo, she thought, and then nothing. She woke to cold. Concrete floor, the smell of industrial chemicals and standing water. A single light, bare bulb, hanging from a ceiling she couldn't determine the height of. Her hands were bound behind her, not to a chair. She was on the floor. Legs free, which was a small mercy, and a deliberate one. Someone wanted her conscious and ambulatory. She held still, catalogued. Her head ached from the sedative, but her mind was clearing, and she ran through what she had. Wrists secured with zip ties. Strong, but zip ties. No weapon. SIG gone. Lipstick case gone. Boots with a steel shank, useful, and training that included 3 separate modules on restraint escape. She had been taken cleanly, professionally, by someone who knew exactly what she was. The door opened. Julian Nero was 42 years old and looked 55. In the way of men who had spent decades burning their vitality on cruelty, he was compact, gray at the temples, with pale eyes that registered zero warmth. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her with the unhurried ease of a man in complete control and studied her face like she was an exhibit. Agent Voss, he said, I've wanted to meet you properly. She said nothing. The FBI is building a case against me. Not a question. The gala plant was yours. Clever. It almost worked. He tilted his head. Dante Salvatore is not a man who falls for tricks, Agent Voss, and yet you managed it. I was curious how. Natural charm, she said. He smiled. It didn't reach his pale eyes by approximately 1,000 miles. I imagine he's already tearing the city apart looking for you. He's predictable in that way. He stood, clasping his hands behind his back. He'll come for you. And when he does, I'll be ready. 2 problems resolved. He looked at her with something approaching admiration. You were useful, Agent Voss. You didn't even know how useful. My father, she said. His expression changed. A flicker, quickly suppressed. Thomas Voss, she continued, keeping her voice level. Your man Felix Greco. The parking garage, 14 months before the hit. The phone call. Silence. Dante has the transcript, she said. I have it. The FBI has a copy. Julian Nero looked at her for a long moment. Well, he said softly, then I suppose you won't be leaving. He left. She gave herself 10 seconds of pure, private fear, let it wash through her, timed it, put it away, and then she began working on the zip ties. An hour and a half. That was how long it took, with a steel boot shank, to create enough tension in the plastic to snap it at the binding point. 40 minutes in, she heard footsteps outside. Guard rotation. Regular, 8 minutes apart. She filed it and kept working. When the ties broke, she sat in the dark and thought about Dante. He would come. She knew that with a certainty that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the way he'd looked at her across the war room. He would come, and he would come with everything he had, and Julian Nero was banking on precisely that, using her as the trigger for Dante's destruction. She was not going to be used as anyone's trigger. She had no weapon. She had one functional plan and the willingness to make it work. The door opened again. Not Julian this time. A guard. Single, young, slightly too confident. He'd come to check on her, and he'd expected her to still be on the floor. She was standing behind the door. He didn't even get to call out. In the corridor, she took stock in 15 seconds. 2 hallways, 1 staircase, sounds of men above her, 3, maybe 4 voices. She moved toward what sounded like external, toward a draft of cold air from the left corridor, and she was halfway there when she heard it. Outside, distant but unmistakable. Gunshots. Then more. Then an explosion that rattled the light fixture above her head. Dante. She ran toward the sound. Above her, through the floor, through the walls, she heard the violence escalating. Not a raid, not a careful, contained operation. This was wrath. This was a man who had discovered someone had taken something of his and had removed every constraint he operated under. She burst through a door and found herself in an exterior stairwell. And on the stairwell, coming down, was Carlo Salvatore. They stopped, stared at each other. His expression moved through several things quickly. Surprise, calculation, and then a particular flatness that she recognized as a man deciding. "You knew," she said. "You gave them the root. You gave them me." Carlo's jaw tightened. "You're going to ruin everything," he said. "You and your FBI files and your evidence. You were supposed to be a complication he couldn't survive. Not." He stopped. Not what? She watched him. "He loves you," Carlo said, and the bitterness in it was profound and genuine and sad. "He's never loved anything enough to be stupid about it, and I needed him to be stupid." He looked at her with something almost like regret. "I'm sorry." He reached for his weapon. She moved first. 3 seconds. 2 strikes. His gun skittered across the concrete, and she had his arm locked behind him and his face against the wall, and she was breathing hard through her nose, and he was very, very still. "I'm FBI," she said against his ear, "which means I'm giving you a choice Carlo gets that Julian never will. Come with me now, turn evidence on Julian Nero, and live through tonight. Or," she increased the pressure on his arm, "or I leave you here when Dante gets to this building." A pause. "He'll kill me," Carlo said. Quiet and certain. "Even if I cooperate." "Maybe," she said honestly. "But it's the only chance you've got?" From above, the doors at the top of the stairwell blew off their hinges, and Dante Salvatore descended toward them like the end of the world. He had been this before. Not often. He had learned control early and kept it as carefully as anything he owned. But there were times, specific and remembered, when the control stripped away and what remained was older and rawer and entirely without mercy. His father's murder. The betrayal that followed it. Moments where Dante Salvatore ceased to be a man in the suit making calculations and became something that the Salvatore family had been feared for across 3 generations. This was one of those times. They had taken her. He had walked out to the rear garden 40 minutes after she'd gone outside and found the phone on the ground, the call still connected. Alara Chase's voice repeating Scarlett, respond. Scarlett in a loop that had been going for nearly 20 minutes. He hadn't felt anything. That was the sign. When the feeling went, what remained was worse. Marco, injured, had refused to stay behind and refused twice more when told again, and Dante had stopped telling him because he needed every man, and Marco with 1 arm was worth 3 of anyone else. They pulled Alara Chase's intelligence, she'd shared without hesitation, burning every protocol in her book, because she was either genuinely afraid for her agent or smart enough to understand that the man on the other end of the phone was going to find Julian Nero's compound with or without her and preferred him to know the layout. 11 vehicles, 41 men. And Dante at the center of it the way a storm has a center. Moving, deliberate, absolutely specific. The compound was a converted industrial property outside the city. 3 buildings, chain link perimeter, 12 guards visible and presumably more inside. Julian had chosen it for defensibility, which told Dante he'd known this was coming. Good. He wanted Julian to know this was coming. Structure 2, basement level. Alara had said on the phone, holding area. That's where they'll put her. Will, she'd said, not would, because Scarlet was still alive. He held on to that with both hands. They went through the perimeter like it wasn't there. Dante moved through the compound with his men around him and his mind on a single point to basement. Find her. And the violence along the way was comprehensive and unhesitating. Julian's hired soldiers had skill. They had numbers. They had positions. What they didn't have was the particular, terrifying efficiency of men who fought for loyalty rather than money. Every Salvatore soldier in that compound that night had known Marco Valentino for years. Most of them had watched him take a bullet. They were not being gentle. Dante reached Structure 2's rear entrance and was 3 strides from the stairwell door when it opened. He stopped. Scarlet, hair loose, jaw set, blood on her blouse that might or might not be hers, standing in the stairwell doorway with Carlo's arm locked behind him and an expression of such contained, focused fury that for one single suspended second he could only look at her. She was alive. She was standing. She had her prisoner. She was, he thought with a ferocity that took his breath, the most extraordinary person he had ever seen. Then, he saw Carlo. The world went very quiet. Dante, Scarlet said, and her voice was steady and specific, cutting through the noise of the compound behind him. Listen to me. He was looking at his brother. He gave Julian the route, she said. He gave Julian me. But he also knows everything, names, accounts, evidence of everything the Nero Syndicate has done for the last 8 years. She held his gaze. He's our case, Dante. We need him alive and talking. Carlo was not looking at him. Carlo was staring at the floor with the look of a man who had run out of moves. How long? Dante thought. How long, Carlo? Before the gala? Before Enzo died? The questions were jagged and they would have to wait, because right now there was a compound and a war and a woman he needed to check for injuries before he allowed himself to feel everything else. He crossed to her in 4 strides and put his hands on her face, her jaw, her cheeks, the side of her neck where the sedative had gone in, checking her with careful, methodical hands that were not entirely steady. She stood still and let him. Graze on my arm, bruised ribs, sedative headache, she said quietly. I'm fine. You're not fine. I will be. She reached up and put one hand over one of his on her face, and the contact, her hand on his hand on her face, stopped him absolutely. Hey, her eyes found his. I'm here. I'm okay. I didn't break. She didn't break, he thought, and the ferocity of his relief was a physical thing. No, he said, you never would. From inside the building, shouts. Movement. Marco's voice, sharp and coordinating. Julian's inside? She asked. 3rd floor. His hands dropped to her arms, assessing the graze wound. His men are mostly neutralized. He's cornered. She looked at him. He knew what she was thinking because he was thinking it too. The reckoning that was still ahead, tonight, in this building, and what they would both have to survive to reach the other side of it. Together, she said. Not a request. He took her hand. Together, he said. Marco had Julian Nero on the 3rd floor, backed against a window with 4 Salvatore guns between him and any exit, wearing the expression of a man who had run the calculation and found it didn't add up in his favor. He looked older than Dante remembered from the gala. He looked cornered, which suited him. It's over, Julian, Dante said. Julian Nero looked at him, at Scarlet at his side, at Marco's arm in a sling and the gun in Marco's good hand. His jaw worked once. If I die, Julian said, the truth about your father dies with me. I already have the truth, Dante said. She found it for me. Julian looked at Scarlet. Then you already know what you need, Julian said. Walk away, Salvatore. We're done here. No, Dante said simply. Not tonight. He felt Scarlet's hand tighten on his. One of us might die tonight, she'd feared. Not her, he thought, with absolute iron certainty. Never her. Marco, he said, and Julian Nero finally looked afraid. Julian Nero did not die easily. Men like him never did. They fought with everything they had, not because they valued their lives particularly, but because they could not conceive of a world in which they lost. It was the particular arrogance of men who had operated without consequence for too long, who had come to believe that their power was a natural law rather than a borrowed thing. He had 2 men with him on the 3rd floor. They moved fast when things went bad. A last desperate play, bodies blocking while Julian tried for the window and the fire escape beyond it. Scarlett saw it before Dante did, or rather she moved before the analysis finished, a trained instinct faster than conscious thought, and she cut off Julian's angle, putting herself between him and the window with the cold economy of someone who had done this before. Julian swung. She ducked, caught his arm, redirected his momentum, and put him hard into the wall. The 2 guards went down in the same seconds, Dante and Marco moving with the fluid coordination of men who had fought beside each other for 12 years. When it was over, Julian was on the floor, wrists secured with his own zip ties, poetic justice, Scarlett had thought, as she'd snapped them, and breathing hard and looking at her with an expression she recognized. He was recalculating. "I want a deal," Julian said. "You don't have anything to negotiate with," Dante said. "Dante." Scarlett touched his arm, not stopping him but asking him to wait. She crouched in front of Julian, and she made her voice even and clear and federal. "Julian Nero, I am FBI Special Agent Scarlett Voss. You are under arrest for conspiracy. Multiple counts of murder, including the murder of Thomas Voss and Enzo Salvatore, trafficking and racketeering." She held his gaze. "My department has had a warrant for your arrest for 3 years. Tonight you helped us execute it." Julian stared at her, then he laughed, a short, involuntary sound, something almost like admiration beneath the bitterness. "You brought the FBI into my house," he said to Dante. "She brought herself," Dante replied. "I just kept her." Carlo was dealt with separately. He was in the ground floor office, sitting in a chair with Marco's spare man watching him, when Dante walked in. Scarlett stood in the doorway because this was not hers to navigate, because some reckoning had to belong to the men whose blood it ran in. She watched Dante sit across from his brother. The silence between them was its own language. "How long?" Dante asked. Carlo didn't look away. Whatever else he was, he'd never been a coward about being seen. 3 years, he said quietly, since before Papa died. Something moved in Dante's face. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. Something like the final confirmation of a truth he'd been afraid to look at directly. "Did you?" He stopped. "Did you know what Julian would do to him?" Carlo was quiet for a long time. "I didn't know he'd order the hit," he said finally. "I knew he wanted the war. I thought I was stupid. I thought if the family was destabilized, there'd be a restructure. I thought I'd have a role." He looked at his hands. "By the time I understood what Julian was, I was too deep in." "And her?" Dante's voice did not change. "You gave them Scarlett. I thought she'd be leverage. I thought you thought wrong." Dante stood. "About everything." He walked out without looking back. In the corridor, he stood for a moment with his back to the wall, and Scarlett stood beside him and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. She put her hand in his, the same way he had taken her hand earlier in the night, the same uncomplicated claim, and he held it, hard. "It's over," she said softly. He exhaled. Long and slow. "It's over," he agreed. Marco arranged Carlo's transport to a secure location for the night. An uneasy, carefully negotiated arrangement that would become, in the weeks that followed, a formal cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. It was not justice exactly. It was the particular compromise that reality demanded from stories where the villain shares blood with the hero. Carlo Salvatore would testify. He would live. He would not live well. Julian Nero was processed through federal custody the following morning. The warrant had been in the system for 3 years, and the FBI took him with the quiet, thorough efficiency of an institution that had been waiting a long time to close a file. Alara Chase met Scarlett in the parking lot of the federal building at 7 in the morning, and she looked at her agent for a long moment. At the grays wound, the bruised jaw, the 3-day-old clothes, the unfamiliar steadiness in Scarlett's eyes, and said, "You fell in love with him." "I'm working through it," Scarlett said. "Of course you are." Alara handed her coffee. "The department is going to want a full debrief. 30 pages minimum." "I know. And then I imagine you have somewhere to be." Alara looked at her over the rim of her cup. "The case is closed, Scarlett. You're not undercover anymore." She let that settle. Not undercover, no mission, no cover name, no constructed reason to be near him. Just herself. Scarlett Voss, with a dead father and a closed case, and a mafia boss who had looked at her in the aftermath of battle and held her hand like it was the most important thing he'd done all night. "Yeah," she said softly, "I have somewhere to be." 3 weeks later, the Salvatore estate was quieter than it had been in years, not silent. It would never be silent, this house with its constant movement of men and business and the low hum of empire. But there was a quality of ease to the quiet that felt new, like a held breath finally released. Like a house that had been braced against a storm and was now tentatively exhaling. The case had closed. Julia Nero was awaiting trial on 15 federal charges, anchored by Carlo's testimony and the evidence Scarlett had delivered through proper channels. The Felix Greco transcript, the financial records, the convoy intelligence that had been leaked from inside the Salvatore organization. The FBI had gotten what they wanted. The Salvatore family had, through complex legal and political negotiation that Alara had frankly managed brilliantly, avoided direct federal scrutiny in exchange for the evidence and testimony. It was messy. It was complicated. It was the kind of compromise that reality forced when the truth turned out to be more tangled than the theory. Scarlett had handed in her 30-page debrief, taken the formal reprimand for protocol breaches, 3 separate counts, each meticulously documented, and accepted the commendation that came simultaneously, because she had also closed a 5-year-old murder case, dismantled the Nero Syndicate's upper structure, and brought in a cooperating witness that the department had been trying to flip for 4 years. Alara had said, very specifically, "I want you back in the field in 6 weeks, after your personal situation resolves." She had used air quotes around personal situation. Alara had opinions. Scarlett was sitting in Dante's library. Her library, she'd begun to think of it, which was a tell she refused to examine, reading a novel that she was definitely paying attention to. When he walked in at 8 in the evening with 2 glasses of wine and an expression she'd come to recognize as him having decided something, she closed the book. He sat across from her. Set the wine down. He was wearing the white shirt again, no jacket, and he looked at her with that particular steadiness that she'd stopped finding unsettling and started finding, against every reasonable objection she could construct, comforting. "I want to talk about what comes next," he said. She picked up her wine. "Okay, the case is closed. Your operation is finished." He paused. "The reasons that put you in this house are gone." "Yes, which means you're here now by choice." He held her gaze. "I want to know if that's what this is." She looked at him, the man in the file who had turned out to be the most honest person she'd encountered in 6 years of lying professionally, the monster who had learned to be careful with exactly one person, the man who had held her hand in a burning building and whispered, "You never would," when she said she'd survived. "It's a choice," she said. "It's been a choice since the garden." He set down his wine. He reached into the inside pocket of the jacket he'd discarded on the arm of the chair, and what he took out was not what she expected. It was a ring, old gold dark stone, set low and practical, the kind of ring a woman could wear with her hands. Alongside it, on the table, he set something else. His own signet ring, the Salvatore crest, and a folded handkerchief. She understood, suddenly, what this was. "This was my mother's ring," he said. "She gave it to my father as her oath to him, not the wedding ring that came later. This was the private one. The first one." He looked at it. "In this family, the oath comes before the ceremony. It always has. Dante," she said very carefully, "I need to say something first. He looked up at her. I know what you gave up, the case you built, the career you might have had without the complications I brought into it. I know what your father meant to you, and I know that I was the wrong suspect for 5 years, and I know the cost of that. He paused. I can't undo any of it. I can spend whatever time I have making sure the world you walk through is as safe as I can make it. He looked at her steadily. That's not nothing from a man like me. She looked at the ring, the signet, the folded handkerchief. She understood the blood oath element of it and the mafia tradition it represented, and she should have found it archaic and instead found it inexplicably and entirely right. You're asking me to marry a mafia boss, she said. I'm asking you to marry me, he said. The empire comes with it. The complication comes with it. The life. He stopped. Marry me, he said, quiet and direct, or I'll kidnap you again. She laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly. A real warm laugh, unperformed and unguarded, and he looked at it like she'd given him something he hadn't known to want. Was that funny? He asked. It was the most you thing you've ever said to me. She looked at the ring, then at him. I'm still an FBI agent. I know. I'm going back to work in 6 weeks. I know. We'll fight about this, about all of it, constantly. I'm counting on it. The almost smile. I've been bored my entire life until you walked up to me at that gala and straightened my pocket square. She picked up the ring. She looked at it for a long moment. Her father's face came to her. Not sad, she realized. Clear, the way he'd looked at her when she was 12, telling her she had a talent for understanding people, for finding the truth beneath the story they presented. Use it well, he'd said. Find the real thing when you find it. She slid the ring onto her finger. Yes, she said. Marco appeared in the doorway approximately 4 seconds later, which suggested he had been standing very close to it. Finally, he said with great dignity and disappeared again, 8 months later. The Hotel Blackmore was exactly as it had been the last time she stood in this room. Crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, the specific cocktail of old money and quiet menace that made the air taste like expensive decisions. The charity gala, annual and apparently inescapable, was in full glittering swing around them, and Scarlett Voss Salvatore stood at the edge of the room in a dress the color of winter roses, a glass of champagne she was this time actually drinking, and the particular serenity of a woman who was exactly where she intended to be. 8 months. A wedding, 3 weeks after the proposal. Small, private, conducted in the Salvatore estate garden in the early morning light with Marco as witness, Alara as somewhat tearful and thoroughly professional maid of honor, and a priest who Dante had called at 6 in the morning with a combination of financial incentive and absolute authority that had proved remarkably persuasive. She'd worn something simple and white. He'd worn black, because of course he had. The blood oath had been spoken in the old way. Her palm and his palm, the brief sting of the blade, the press of hands, ancient and strange and profoundly, inexplicably moving. Mine, he'd said, in front of the priest, and Marco and Alara, and the garden and the morning. Yours, she'd said back, and meant it so completely it had no edge left. 8 months of learning to live inside the life she'd chosen. And it was a life, complicated and loud and never simple, the way all real things were. Her work, 6 weeks had become 8, had become a permanent restructuring of her role into something that required creative interpretation of about 12 departmental guidelines, and Alara had required 3 glasses of wine to sign off on it, existed alongside his. The empire continued to be what it was. She continued to be what she was. They fought, occasionally spectacularly, about lines and codes and the particular friction of 2 people with strong and sometimes opposing principles, choosing to share a life. It was, she had decided, approximately perfect. The pregnancy she'd discovered 4 weeks ago was something she was carrying privately for one more night. She'd tell him tonight. She'd already told Alara, because she'd needed to tell someone, and Alara had said, of course, in a tone of absolute unsurprise that suggested she'd been waiting for this information. She watched Dante across the room. He was in a black suit. He was talking to two men she recognized as a new allied family from the south, and he was half listening to them because the other half of his attention had been, all evening on her. She felt it as a warmth at the edge of her vision, a constant quiet check-in, the particular attention of a man who had spent 8 months perfecting the art of watching over someone without making them feel watched. Marco was at his shoulder. Marco's wrist had healed. Marco had, over the course of 8 months, developed a relationship with Scarlett that she could only describe as warmly exasperated, which was, she suspected, his highest form of affection. She moved through the room. She was not running an operation. There was no earpiece, no mission, no calculated angle. She moved because she wanted to. Through the crowd she no longer needed to read as threat factors. Toward the man at the center of the room. He saw her coming. The two men talking to him became entirely irrelevant. She stopped in front of him. The same distance as 8 months ago, the same chandeliers, the same polished marble. And she looked up at him with a slow, deliberate smile, and she watched the dark eyes warm in a way they only did for her. "You look lonely," she said. Something moved through him. Recognition, deep and private, and theirs alone. He took a step toward her, closing the distance, and his hand came to her jaw the way it always did, certain and careful, the two things that defined him. He leaned in. His mouth brushed her ear. "Listen carefully, Bella," he murmured, and his voice was silk and dark and entirely familiar, the same register as the first whispered warning 8 months ago in this room, when she had been a stranger with a mission and he had been a file in a drawer. "Because I will only say this once." She smiled. "I love you," Dante Salvatore said softly. "More than the Empire, more than the Code, more than my own blood." He pulled back enough to look at her face. "That is my warning. That is the only one you'll ever need." She looked at him. "I'm going to tell you tonight," she thought. "About the baby. About the rest. About all the years ahead that are going to be complicated and loud and real and ours." She reached up, straightened the already straight pocket square on his lapel, and let her hand rest on his chest over his heart. "I love you," she said, "even though you're insufferable." "Especially because I'm insufferable," he corrected. "That too." He laughed, quiet, private, entirely real, and she felt it against her palm, the physical evidence of the thing she had found beneath the monster and the Empire and the Code. A man who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone unafraid enough to walk up to him in the most dangerous room in Chicago and touch him first. She had walked into his trap, he had walked into hers. And they had both come out the other side of blood and fire and war, and stood here, in the room where it started, with everything ahead. "Marco, from 3 feet away, you're making a spectacle again." "Yes," Dante said, without looking away from her. "Good," Marco said, and signaled the waiter for a drink because some things in this world were exactly as they should be. The chandeliers threw their light across the marble floor in fractures of brilliant white, and Scarlett Voss Salvatore stood in the center of it all with her husband's hand at her jaw and a secret and a future and the ring on her finger that had started with an oath. And she was, finally, completely, exactly where she'd chosen to be, not trapped. Home.